In the quiet hush of the hospital's long-term care wing, where the beeping machines learned to breathe with the patients and time itself seemed to soften its steps, Alina sat beside Mr. Elias Rowan and sang so softly that even the shadows leaned in to listen, her voice a thin ribbon of warmth weaving through the sterile air, a melody she'd learned as a child from a mother who believed songs could hold broken things together, and Mr. Rowan, once a schoolteacher who could recite poetry like prayer, rested in his wheelchair with eyes closed, his hands folded like leaves at the end of autumn, his breathing shallow but steady as Alina hummed the tune he loved, the one that always made his brow unknit and his fingers twitch as if remembering chalk and blackboards and the laughter of children long grown. Alina didn't sing for applause or thanks, she sang because care, to her, was not a checklist but a promise, and when she leaned close and brushed his shoulder with the gentle certainty of someone who knew how fragile hope could be, she whispered stories between verses, stories of the sunrise she'd watched on her way to work, of the pigeons that danced along the sidewalk like old men with jokes, of the tea she'd brew later with honey because her throat was tired but her heart wasn't, and Mr. Rowan stirred, his lips forming a smile that had been absent for weeks, the kind that came from being seen rather than saved. What Alina couldn't know, was that a man stood in the doorway, frozen between steps, wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than most cars, his hair neatly combed yet betraying the disarray inside him, his eyes wide with a shock that had nothing to do with hospital smells or fluorescent lights and everything to do with recognition, because the man watching was Daniel Rowan, the son who had left home early to conquer a world that applauded profits louder than people, the millionaire whose calendar had replaced birthdays with board meetings, and whose phone buzzed constantly with numbers that rose and fell like tides, and he had not expected to find his father cradled by a stranger's song, not expected to feel his chest tighten as if a fist had closed around his heart, not expected tears to threaten the composure he had perfected in glass towers and private jets. Daniel had come late, as he often did, postponing visits until guilt outpaced convenience, and he had rehearsed his apology on the elevator ride up, but the words dissolved when he saw the way Alina's hand rested on his father's shoulder, not possessive, not performative, just present, and in that presence Daniel saw everything he had traded away, the evenings he'd missed, the phone calls unanswered, the simple mercy of time, and he stood there as the song ended, as Alina's voice faded into silence so complete it felt holy, and when Mr. Rowan opened his eyes, watery but clear, he whispered her name like a benediction, Alina, and Daniel flinched because he realized his father said the caregiver's name more often now than his own. Alina noticed the men in the doorway then, startled but polite, nodding with the professional warmth she'd learned to wear like armor, and Daniel introduced himself, his voice too formal for the moment. I'm his son, as if that explained the way his hands shook, and Alina smiled, the kind of smile that made space rather than demanded it, and said, he's been waiting for you, not as an accusation but as a fact, and Daniel swallowed, stepping forward to take his father's hand, which felt smaller than he remembered, lighter, and Mr. Rowan squeezed weakly, eyes shining with something between pride and relief, and said, she sings, as if that alone justified the world's existence. Over the next days Daniel came earlier and stayed longer, watching Alina work with an attention he usually reserved for spreadsheets, noticing how she listened before acting, how she spoke to patients as if they were chapters rather than cases, how she stayed late without complaint, how she paid for a patient's favorite pudding when the cafeteria ran out, and he learned, quietly, that Alina worked 2 jobs to send money home to a younger brother in school, that she had dreams she folded carefully so they wouldn't tear, that she believed dignity was the truest form of medicine. The hospital administrators praised efficiency, but Daniel saw devotion, and the more he watched, the heavier his success felt, until one evening, after Mr. Rowan had fallen asleep to another gentle song, Daniel asked Alina to walk with him to the vending machines, where the lights hummed and the choices were few, and he told her who he was, not as a flex but as a confession, and she listened without changing her expression, because money, to her, was a tool, not a measure, and when he offered to help, vaguely and awkwardly, she shook her head and said, just be here for him, and the simplicity of that request broke him open. Daniel began to be present in ways he'd never been present before, feeding his father soup, listening to the stories he'd heard 100 times and never truly heard, learning the song Alina sang so he could hum along, and in that shared care something shifted, not just in the room but in the man himself, until one afternoon Daniel asked Alina to meet him in the garden outside the ward, where sunlight filtered through leaves like forgiveness, and he told her he was funding a program for caregivers, scholarships, fair wages, training, respite, not as charity but as acknowledgement, and he asked her to help design it, because she knew what care really meant. Alina hesitated, wary of promises that glittered and faded, but Daniel's eyes held steady, and when Mr. Rowan passed quietly weeks later, his hand in his son's and Alina's song in the air, the grief was deep but not empty, because something good had been born of love finally learned, and at the small memorial Daniel spoke not of wealth or legacy, but of a caregiver who sang, and he honored her by changing the way he lived, by choosing presence over applause, and when he offered Alina a future she hadn't dared to imagine, a leadership role, education, a chance to shape care for thousands, she accepted, not because it changed her life, but because it allowed her to keep changing others. And if this story moved you, if you believe kindness still matters and that quiet goodness can reshape the loudest rooms, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, because every story you support helps us tell another one that reminds the world to listen, to show up, and to sing softly when it counts.